our move for today in Interp is to kind of take that first real step past just working on themes. We've been working on themes for about a week now, and you can see there's a lot of work that goes into that, putting together that theme, like what you want to talk about and kind of the angles, plural, you want to take on it, and rolling that all together in one sentence is a good chunk of work, but it's the right kind of work. It's the wise work to be done. This is how you sort of measure twice and cut, right? And everything else flows from that effort that you put in. So, good theme, you're set up, and you can have good content, good experiences, good connections with people and the topics. Bad theme, that's kind of a lower ceiling for how high you can blast off. So, we'll continue talking about themes, but let's kind of expand it now into the context of the rest of what you're planning on marshaling for any particular Interp experience. Now, Interp can be signs, it can be staffed instead, something like a guided hike or an amphitheater talk, or even a college-style lecture. Sometimes that's a thing, and that's part of how Interp actually got started as a profession a little over 100 years ago. But whatever you decide to do in terms of format or the modality, that's one of the next things you want to pick after you're pretty happy with your theme, because the modality is going to make some hard choices for you in terms of what specifically you can do content presentation-wise, how you can communicate it, what's the vehicle by which you're getting some invitation or sense of connection to your topic across to your visitors or participants. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about other chunks of the outline in a little bit more detail today, and we want to start that with, again, in the context of already having a halfway polished, like a draft 2 or 3 or 4 theme. We'll talk about picking modalities next. So from there, we can start filling in lots and lots of detail on the actual outline of what you're going to do. But it doesn't make sense to do this stuff until we've got the modality nailed down after our theme's nailed down. So let's talk about different modes. Again, we talked about staffed and non-staffed. So earlier in the semester, we had a short list up on the whiteboard here of different ways you can sort of engage with people. And this is kind of a personal choice, and it's also a choice that's heavily driven by your topic and your theme. So if you're like me and you are a very strong introvert, then you want to think real hard about choosing some staffed modalities. Stick with me on this. Introverts are people that spend energy to interact with folks, right? Like there's an internal battery on each of us, and it's ticking down Neon Genesis Evangelion style the moment we unplug from solitude and get in front of people. And when that 90 seconds is up, man, the robot goes down and the angels take over the world and get in the robot Shinji. Anyway, so extroverts, on the other hand, those are the life of the party, the person that is getting energy from interacting with people, not spending it. And so the counterintuitive move for us introverts, if that's you as well, is to think real hard about staffed kinds of Interp, because with some solid preparation and planning, introverts can actually be really, really good at staffed Interp, because we tend to prefer more of or prepare, sharpen the pencil, study up on the thing, enjoy the thing as well, if it's a positive topic. And then that passion shows up through an introvert really pretty well in a staffed format. Extroverts, you do you, boo. If you're an extrovert and you tend to kind of think your way to what you want to say while saying everything along the way, that can be kind of overwhelming for folks when they're participating in your staffed Interp. And there's nothing wrong with being an external or a verbal processor. That's just a personal style thing. But extroverts tend to feel kind of constrained by this outline, and introverts tend to feel comforted by it. So either way, however you're wired, maybe you're an ambivert, you're sort of halfway in between, you're kind of okay with hanging out with people in large crowds or noisy environments, and you're perfectly okay without that, or either pole on either side of that, right? This is a useful tool for us. Okay, so let's kind of put together a bigger, more detailed list of staffed and non-staffed modalities so that we can get a clear sense of which of these kind of, with just like a one-sentence description of each, which of these kind of resonate or appeal to you personally. Because you as the professional, you have to make some pretty important choices about how you're going to spend your work energy, right? If you take the example of a professional interpreter like Shelton Johnson that we saw on our previous class session on Monday, Shelton has to put together the kind of guided hikes that he can sustain doing for the next 35 years, right? That's about how long a typical career lasts, right? So from 35, 40 years from age, 20 to 60, 25 to 65, something like that. So if it's staffed interp with a whole bunch of run around, have a bunch of fun, high energy games, that's going to work great when Shelton is graduating college and starting to work at Yosemite, and he's 27 years old and he's got some energy and his knees aren't blown out yet. But when you get sort of old and sad and gray in the beard, for those of you who are beard types, you have to take a step back from that and be like, I don't know if my knees can handle these run around wild and crazy fun games that are doing a great job of conveying, and inviting people through this particular style of content, but I just can't physically keep it up. Another part of this is your vocal apparatus. If you're planning staffed interp, you need to plan things that you can talk your way through on a typical work week, 5 days a week, for hours each day, with some breaks in between and so forth, maybe even some vocal training to figure it out. But not like shouting at people over noisy waterfalls in a cave, for example, all day, every day for 40 years, because your vocal flaps will develop essentially fibroid scar tissue, nodules, start to lose muscle tonicity, and you get that sort of hoarse sound to your voice that, if you've ever been to a concert or a festival and like scream your lungs out when your favorite band or performer goes on stage, and you're kind of hoarse for a day or two afterwards, think that, but permanent and literally painful to just talk, right? So that's a serious problem. Like spending your health, using up your body to accomplish your professional goals, you can't really sustain that very long. And of course, in forestry, we're all about sustainable and resilient, okay? So there are serious trade-offs to these choices of, do I do non-staffed or do I do staffed interpretation? If I do non-staffed, and I put all this cool, exciting stuff that I've compiled or figured out or experienced and I'm trying to bring other people into, if all that's in a book, that's awesome. I don't have to blow out my vocal cords doing that. On the other hand, how many books did you read in the last 12 months? Like actual paper books, sat down and read books. Some of us are book nerds, and that's a pretty long list. Like, you go hard on Goodreads. Like, you have people following you for your book list. That's not most of us, though, right? So there is a quality that is difficult to reconstitute in a book or a video or an audio recording. We'll talk about personal audio tours and so forth. Non-staffed interpretation, you have to work harder to reach the same level of effect. You might be able to reach more people with printed stuff or online stuff, but we don't read web pages. We scan them. We haven't read web pages in over a decade. as a species. Okay? We don't even use the web that much anymore. It's all apps. It's all walled gardens. Anyway, so these are real and meaningful choices, and you need to make that choice based on your physical and sort of personal energy level predilections, what you kind of lean towards in terms of socializing with folks or not, and also what's best for the content, because the ethical burden of being an interpreter is selecting topics and choosing perspectives on those topics that are important, that matter. You're making values decisions. You're editorializing in a way. You are deciding not to include a lot more stuff than you are including necessarily, right? So for every topic, there's a million subtopics or more specific topics. And for every specific subtopic, there are a million different perspectives or themes or different ways to get at it. And so out of that 1/1,000,000th of 1,000,000, there's a whole lot more that's not getting said than is being said. So we have to make some hard decisions on picking each type. Now, for this class, this semester, we're going to try out a whole bunch of different staff things, just kind of see how it works, see what you're a natural with, what you're kind of not, and that's okay because none of this is an art. None of us is born as a great interpreter. All of us can train up into that. And we'll try out some non-staffed interp styles for those of you who like wrangling or wrestling Microsoft Word or PowerPoint sometimes we use, or Unity, a game development engine, or Unreal Engine, or a text editor for a website that interprets some stuff. Whatever. And you're going to love some of it, you're going to hate some of it, and most of it you'll at least kind of tolerate and be like, okay, I see what the point is on this, whether or not I like it. Okay? So for staffed kinds of interpretation, we have things like guided hikes. That's what you saw with Shelton Johnson. So you gather a group of people, 2, 3, 4, on up to a few hundred. There's typically a physical audibility limit beyond a couple of hundred people. And the bigger your group is, the more time you spend or lose to just sort of getting from spot to spot. That's okay. It's the price you pay if you have some interesting spots to get to. We also have things like the aforementioned amphitheater talks. So these will be like campfire talks. At Mammoth Cave, for example, there's a big literal amphitheater with, sort of curved ranks of seats, and there's a huge fire pit. It's about 10 feet wide, a couple of feet deep, and they build a big old bonfire anytime there's typically a dusk time interpretive talk. And they also have a little stage. It's raised about a foot above the lowest seats there. And the backstop to the stage has speakers and a projector, so you can get Death by PowerPointed at a national park at sunset. That's right. Some people pay extra for that. Just kidding. They're free. Okay, so there are also lecture-style talks where the interp is best served by sort of direct or didactic information transfer. We get that sort of classroomy vibe to it. And sometimes, most of the time, it's not a professor doing it, so it's hopefully a more engaging talk than a class lecture like this. This will be somebody who experienced the topic and live to tell about it, and they're there to do that with you and for you. Okay? There are also things like cultural demonstrations. So, for example, in a sec, we can take a look at some videos of Native American rituals that involve dance among Great Plains and southwestern nations, like southwestern would be like Navajo, Ute, Paiute, Southern Ute, stuff like that. And so some of those each year for the past several years have showed up at the Grand Canyon South Rim Village where there's an outdoor sort of performance area. It's a literal raised stage, and they just put some of their music on loudspeakers, and or sometimes they'll have a live group of musicians, typically drummers, providing drumming and or chanting. And then if you're familiar with things like hoop dances from the Great Plains nations, they'll have up to half a dozen folks on stage demonstrating different aspects of those particular dances. And I'll explain. So this is one that we do to greet other tribes when we join together, every several years for a big mood or conflation, something like that. This one is one we'll use for kicking off our version of a wedding ceremony. This is one that we use to communicate the tribe's needs to any of our particular deities and stuff like that. So they'll kind of describe it a little bit, and crucially, they're typically doing it not in costume, because it's not a costume. It's like the legit actual clothing that they use for those religious and social rites and rituals. So this is a really cool thing. This is the real deal. Cultural demonstrations are typically best done by members of that culture. You can imagine how it would be kind of... Is culture splaining a word? It'd be like mansplaining, but from one culture to another, We don't want to tell white folks what Native Americans are doing. Let's ask the Native Americans and see how they're interested in engaging with that or not. We also have, along the lines of demonstrations, something called a skill demonstration. Skill demos are awesome. This is typically the kind of thing where you could waste a whole bunch of time and words on explanation, or you could just show somebody how it works. And you guys been to Colonial Williamsburg? Out east? Okay. Maybe not? Okay. You guys been to a national battlefield? Shiloh, Antietam, Bull Run, Manassas, Gettysburg. Typically, national historic parks, national military parks are chock full of skill demonstrations. So they'll have interpretive staff, not just they're not in costume, they're in the actual period-accurate uniform materials and so forth. And they'll be demonstrating things like how to load and fire a musket, or how to load and fire a field piece, like cannon or artillery, something like that. And at Colonial Williamsburg, there's a guy who very famously was interviewed as he was retiring from working something like 45 years in the armorer's shop at Colonial Williamsburg, which is like a whole, essentially, village of living history interpreters. And, the interview question was, so what do you do? He said, well, I've spent the last 45 years taking apart this musket, and then I put it back together. And he does that while folks, tourists, visitors, families, they're just kind of walking by, and they can see that something interesting is happening. The guy's in period-accurate garb using period-correct tools on an actual musket from that time period that's been well-preserved. And you get a sense for what life was like in a much more effective way, or how people do stuff in a much more true and effective and engaging way than just reading a book about it. It's different when you're standing right in front of the person and they're doing it right there. So, for this class, anything that you are, anything that you're good at, or that you enjoy doing, that can lend itself really well to a skill demonstration modality for any of your interpretive topics that are around that particular skill set. So that could be something like kayaking, rock climbing, knot tying, flint knapping, so making bladed edges for axes or arrow points or spear points, that sort of a thing. Skill demos are super cool. Now, to the extent that you can make those interactive and start teaching your participants how to do some of this stuff, where you can make that very safe, right? We don't want random people picking up flint knapping tools and like cutting their finger off. Not that that's a common thing, but you make some pretty sharp stuff with flint knapped edges, or obsidian knapped edges in particular. That's a wonderful thing to do, right? So at Mount Rushmore, anybody been to Mount Rushmore? Sounds good. Okay. Did they have any skill demonstrations going on there? Usually that's like a late spring to early fall only kind of a thing because the weather gets pretty burly up there. But if you were there recently, they have all kinds of living history and skill demo kind of stuff going on. Was that anything that you ever saw there? Or?
It was a long time ago.
Okay, yeah, no worries. If any of you guys have been to St. Louis Zoo, they do a lot of skill demo kind of stuff there. For certain among the animal enclosures, they don't call them cages anymore, they're enclosures. This is 2024. They feed some of the animals on purpose in a way that everybody can see. It's a skill demonstration, even if it's a pretty low-key one. Okay? So, a related one is living history. And Shelton Johnson was also doing living history interpretation in the video clip that we saw in our previous class session. So, he was taking on the persona, not of a single individual soldier, but as he explained in that video, kind of an amalgamation, a hypothetical assemblage of all the biographical information he could get on any of those Buffalo soldiers in that unit, detailed to Yosemite. And he sort of created a personality out of that, and then put on the period-accurate uniform, not costume, and delivered that hike. You can combine these. He delivered that hike from the perspective of Sergeant Elise Bowman, not from the perspective of Shelton Johnson. So that is a really cool way to sort of tear down a little bit of a very polite barrier between you and your participants in staffed Interp. When you show up as somebody from a different time, a different place and time, or what have you, like, just the fact of showing up in those clothes, you don't have to talk about how uncomfortable and scratchy a wool pair of underwear and uniform is. Like, people can kind of see it. And you don't necessarily have to talk through a whole bunch of stuff because you're modeling it. It's already there. And if a picture's worth 1,000 words, and your brain sees about 100 megapixels 30 times a second, then we can get a lot of interp done. Like a lot of interp done. That's a ton of data going into your brain continuously without having to say a word about it. So him playing a reed flute, playing games appropriate to soldiers of the late 1800s, early 1900s, with participants and stuff like that. Pulling out his mess kit and demonstrating eating a snack of what was kind of the field ration issued to those soldiers at the time, and so forth. You don't have to say a thing. Maybe you make an offhanded comment of, wow, this hardtack is awful. I think I just chipped a tooth. But you don't have to like talk through everything about it. You can just sort of show instead of telling. And good storytellers show more than they tell. Okay? Cool. So, with that, these are most of our forms of staffed interpretation. We do have a few others. We have the information desk, we have roving interpretation, and we also have station interpretation. So, have you guys and gals, non-binary pals, ever been to like a national park visitor center, or state park visitor center, or Crab Orchard's new visitor center, or any of the visitor centers that the Shawnee used to operate? Now there's fewer. Yeah? All right. Did you see anybody in a uniform at like the front desk? Okay. Yeah, this is crucial. So most folks who show up at a national park, or the Shawnee National Forest, or Crab Orchard, or what have you, The National Park Service alone operates over 400 distinct units. So there's a lot of these info desks, a lot of visitor centers. That person is typically the only agency staff person that visitor family or group or individual is going to be interacting with, right? You'll see some other folks, doing maintenance work, doing field biology work, doing forestry stuff, what have you out in the field, but they're out doing that stuff and they're not really there to talk to you. But interpretive staff assigned to the front desk, the information desk, this is kind of the tip of the spear, as corny as it sounds, for visitor contact and interpretation. So almost always, at least at national park visitor centers, you will see a very specific sequence of events sort of trigger automatically when somebody walks up, with or without the rest of their group or their family, up to the information desk. The ranger will reach for one of the black bar maps, right? The paper maps, unfold it, flip it around so it's right side up to the visitor, not to them. You get pretty good at reading stuff upside down. And they'll pull out a Sharpie. And they'll ask, welcome. What brings you to Mammoth Cave National Park? Or Isle Royal Visitor Center? Or Acadia National Park, Hulls Cove Visitor Center, or whatever. Is this your first time here? And that sort of open-ended pair of questions gives a whole bunch of info to the interpreter, and you're not interpreting like a specific chosen topic with a theme. You're interpreting the whole ass place. And you're sort of customizing it on the fly. You're coming up with your 5-part outline here in that conversation as the person's answering this question. And before that visitor is done talking, it's your mission to start circling stuff on the map. Oh, okay, so you guys are here to catch some waves? All right, well, here's how you get to Sand Beach here at Acadia National Park. And you want to make sure to try to go early, before about 11 a.m. We tend to see this time of year the parking kind of fills up right about there. So you're giving kind of insider info to folks who aren't insiders yet to help make folks feel welcome and functional with the logistics that they'll need to know in order to connect with, what they'd like to do in your national park. But you're also humanizing the space. It's just a big map with a whole bunch of labels and typically some nice colored pencil illustrations and stuff like that around the edges or blank spots on the map. And it's kind of impossible to know where to start. So you're that person's guide. Even if you're not with them physically on the rest of their trip throughout the park, you're absolutely helping to condense meaning out of the vapor of nuance. There's a whole bunch of nuance on this map, and you are editorializing. You are providing themes like, okay, I see you're here with your family. While you're here, you said you're going to be here for about a week. Okay. Think about this particular loop trail. It's relatively easy for the littler kids. They won't have to do any big strides over rushing water or over big fallen logs or anything like that. It's a well-maintained trail. And it'll take you to some really beautiful overlooks that tend to be a huge hit with some of our younger guests. So here's the parking lot for that. Here are the hours for it. If you guys should find yourselves in any trouble, there's pretty good cell coverage in that area. Just call 911. It'll connect you to park dispatch, and we'll get help to you as soon as we can, and so forth. So you're not just providing logistic stuff like, here's the parking lot, but it's also, hey, this trail's a really good idea based on what you're telling me. This trail over here, it's awesome. It's probably a terrible fit from what you're describing that you'd like from your trip this week. So let me help you kind of restore or bring some order, some value judgment, some estimations on what might be really good for you. Let me invite you into the space in a very, very functional way. So that conversation is 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes? Not a big deal. But it completely changes the trajectory and it elevates the quality of that family or that group's visit by quite a lot. So this is a big deal. It's not maybe as sexy as leading a whole bunch of rock climbing trips or cave tours or something like that. But man, this is where a ton of the magic happens, right? Everybody's busy, everybody's distracted, everybody's jet lagged, everybody's got to find a toilet. Like right now I got a turtle head poking out. So this is where you welcome people in. It's like, hey guys, bathrooms are right over there. Come on over here. Let me help you out. Let me get your feet on the ground and face pointed in a direction that will be awesome for you. Okay? In addition to the info desk, again, we have the station Interp. So this is where folks are wandering around, and they might sort of stop by where you're sort of posted up, and maybe you have some demonstrations, some touchable objects, or some touch tanks with live animals, if that's appropriate. This is station Interp. It's often paired with skill demonstrations, right? So that guy disassembling and reassembling that musket as an armorer from the 17 and early 1800s. This is a skill demonstration happening at a station, and people kind of filter by, and they might stand there for half an hour and chat with you and learn more about what you're talking about. They might not even slow down as they're walking by because they're going for the funnel cake or the turkey leg, stand next door or whatever. Okay? Station Interp is pretty cool. You can kind of set up your home base and have a bunch of stuff, materials, objects, historical artifacts, curios, to hand, and weave a pretty compelling chunk of Interp, and you don't have to do the same thing the same way the whole time. You can sort of vary it up as you like. There's a real individualized vibe to live interpretation to keep it interesting for you, because your people are going to take cues off of your energy level and interest level. Like if you hate your life interpreting, they're going to pick up on that. So mix it up a little bit. Do other stuff. Roving interpretation is where people are wandering around in a space like that big open flat area at Rushmore, and just making contact with folks as they're milling around, looking up and taking that photo that everybody takes of the four presidents and so forth, and they get the photo of them in front of it, waving or holding up Washington's chin or something. There are rangers walking around saying, hey, this is your first time to Mount Rushmore. Did you know that there's a whole bunch of Native American stuff that we've kind of added around the side here, because this is an area that is sacred not just to sort of commemorating the memory of our history here as the United States, but this is a genuinely spiritually sacred area for First Nations folks who've lived in this area for a very long time. So let me walk with you down to that area. We'll show you some of our TP setup. We'll show you how to, we have a skill demonstration down there with a couple of hoop dance type skills. We have a language interpreter just teaching visitors how to speak Lahotan. We would call that Lakota in English, and so forth. So this is those typically 5-10 minute conversations, and every once in a while you get a real enthusiast and you end up chatting with them for half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour, and it's just like this free-ranging conversation, and they're geeking out and you're geeking out, and it's just like, wow, all of a sudden it's time for my break. I'll be back in 20 minutes. I gotta go recharge for a minute. And typically with roving interpretation and station interpretation, when you get into an exciting conversation with somebody, because they're there to connect with you and you're there to connect with them professionally, other people pick up on that and they see that they're kind of missing out on something live happening, and so a crowd gathers. And that feels pretty good as an interpreter. And for a lot of folks working in this capacity, that sort of crowd formation, that boost that you get from seeing like, oh wow, people are interested in what I have to say. People are interested in what I'm doing. Like this is cool and exciting for people. That happens like multiple times a day in a lot of these busy places. It's a pretty cool thing. So that is kind of a quick rundown on or a more detailed rundown on some of our staffed modalities, right? Topic can be anything, right? It's just a question of what works well with the particular topic, your particular wiring as an individual human being, and the overlay of the topic with you. How can you connect with people best? With non-staffed kinds of interpretation, this is going to be pretty much all forms of print media, with a couple of usual suspects in particular, as well as some electronic media. Okay, so non-staffed, we can have interpretive maps. We can also have timelines. We can have sheets, booklets, and full-on books. Don't worry, you don't have to write a book this semester in this class. We'll just practice what it's kind of like, maybe with more of a booklet form, okay? Games are a somewhat less common form of staffed interpretation because games have pretty specific requirements for teaching to folks, being able to play it quickly, being extremely inclusive in who can play the game and how the game mechanics require people to play. But games are very common, ubiquitously common, as non-staffed interpretation. So this semester, part of our assignment is going to be to play a whole bunch of games. And then try our hand at designing a game or 5. Because making a game is actually pretty easy. Making a game that isn't a trash fire and super boring or super hard or kind of broken in some way, really, really hard. So we'll try it out, see what you like. Okay? Maps, timelines, single sheets, multiple sheets, booklets, books, games. And then, according to the title of one of your 2 textbooks for this semester, we have signs, waysides, and exhibits. Signs are, you know what a sign is. An exhibit is a bunch of signs or panels arranged thematically together. Waysides are outdoor exhibits, the kind of thing where you can pull up to it and it's on the side of the road sort of a thing. So those tend to have a very specific kind of construction, very specific materials. They have kind of a specific look about them. If you've ever, as a history major, been driving around and seen those bronze cast historic markers on the side of the highway, that's one form of wayside, okay? And they're pretty good as a form of connecting with your visitors. But, like, you know, you buy once, cry once. You buy an exhibit after designing it, or a wayside made of, you know, cast bronze or something like that, UV stabilized pigments and all of this, and you install it in concrete and so on and so forth, and it's going to be pretty well good to go for the next 50 years. That's highly effective in terms of like number of people interpreted to per dollar spent on that design and installation. It's good for 50 years. That's a pretty good spend. Waysides are pretty terrible, though, for kind of the beating heart of interpretation, that is sparking something, inspiration, alerting or awakening somebody to something that is controversial or problematic to think about. It doesn't really communicate typically that potential sense of excitement or value or worth. Okay? Now, war memorial waysides, a little bit different because, you know, what the topic is, human suffering, death, warfare, combat, stuff like that, it's pretty serious and intense. And those can be pretty solemn and effective in their delivery. If any of you guys have been to any of the war memorials in D.C., yeah? Okay. We're going to go visit those on summer camp this year. Those are amazing, and they affect you. Okay? When you go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., it's just full of signs and exhibits. That's it. Little booklets. They hand you a booklet when you walk in there, and it's got the biographical information of an actual, real human being who was, at some point, sent to a Nazi concentration camp. And as you go throughout the exhibits and you learn what life was like for sort of the unmentionables of that time and place, Jewish people, Catholics, homosexuals, political dissidents, prisoners of war, you'd flip through and you'd read sort of snippets of this person's life experience as they were hiding in the French resistance, in the underground. And then they're caught by Nazi forces after trying to do some partisan work in the French resistance. And they're shipped off to Dachau or Auschwitz-Birkenau or any of the death camps and so forth. And then what was their experience like in there? And then kind of as you exit the museum's exhibits, you flip to the last page and you find out if this person survived or not. And it kind of hits you like, wow, this isn't just a name on a roll. Like this was a college student. This was a husband and father. This was somebody's side chick. It was an actual human being just like you and me, And it hits pretty hard. So those way signs, they can be effective, but it's hard, or it's harder to make those effective or immediately impactful in the same way as any of the staffed kinds of interpretation. Okay? Cool. So, does anybody have any question about any of these modalities or kind of formats or ways of arranging and presenting this content? All right. They all still follow the same 5-part outline. The pre-interp and the post-interp for non-staffed formats is going to be one time. The pre-interp and post-interp sections for staffed interp modalities is going to be every time, sometimes multiple times a day. So, for example, if you are designing a guided hike that you want to use to take people through some history in and around the Shawnee National Forest. I've done this a couple of times before. It's pretty cool stuff. You would spend some time and you would schedule some time that day before you even start talking with anybody to do some pretty important things. So let's round out our sense of where the theme goes in this bigger thing. In our pre-interp section, we are preparing self. Doing a safety check. We are identifying our participants. Pulling up the list of ticketed participants that day, and we're taking a look at, okay, we've got 2 school buses of 7th graders and 1 van full of people from the old folks' home. This is going to be an interesting hike today, right? You want to know that before you walk out in front of everybody, and it's like, hey, everybody, let's not go on a hike today. This is not the right solution today. All right, so we're going to do something else other than the hike today. You don't want to get caught flat-footed with stuff like that, okay? And preparing yourself before leading a 1 or 2 hour guided hike, pretty important stuff, right? So, professionals of all different stripes learn to build in this time to make sure that if you're just having a bad day, like your significant other or your life partner or whatever is you're kind of conflicting a little bit, and you didn't get any sleep last night, and you get this clicking sound in your jaw when you chew, right? That's life. But we can't sort of load that onto our participants. So we need to have some time protected, set aside, ready to go for whatever you need to do to be present and focused, to be hydrated, to make sure you've pottied before you are leading this big thing. And you also want to check through the facility that you're going to use to make sure there are no down branches, no down power cables. That's a thing at a lot of amphitheaters, those that have lighting and so forth. Every time there's a big storm, you have to walk the whole thing beforehand to make sure it's good to go, because if you're trying to manage 120 people safely, you can't be trying to fix some problem on the trail and keeping them safe. That's too much of a split of your focus, and it doesn't work. That is genuinely malpractice. All right. So, with these things, you sort of write that into the outline as your pregame show. Famed operatic tenor Luciano Pavarotti, as part of his preparing self section, took a shot of whiskey before he went out on stage. We could justify a couple of different reasons for that, maybe. Wise or unwise. He was a large man. One shot probably was not much of an issue as far as drunkenness. But it also sort of burned all the snot off of his vocal flaps, and he could go sing operas as a world-famous tenor for 3 hours and be good to go. Okay? So, in that particular profession, that was an important thing for him. And if you guys ever see the movie, it's an old one now, but Schindler's List, real party movie, right? Schindler's List, the violin and viola music from that movie is just absolutely haunting. Even as I'm talking about it, I can hear the leitmotif in my head now. That was fronted by a concert string player named Itzhak Perlman, and as a professional performer, his need for preparing himself, because as a professional in his particular way of coming at it, music was an expression of prayer to him. I believe he's Jewish, I think, or was. I don't know if he's still alive. Anyway, so his preparing self thing before every concert for years was to pray for hours in his dressing room, because he'd practiced. He's an extremely skilled, world-class violinist, and he didn't need to practice anymore. He didn't need to look at the sheet music. That's all in here already. So he needed to make sure that the rest of him was squared away, and the way that he did that was through prayer. Now, you don't have to follow any particular spiritual practice in this class, of course, but if that's an important part of your life, then you want to hold some space for that. That's a sane thing to do. That's a very powerful and effective thing to do for those of you who are into that kind of a thing. Okay? So, for others, maybe that's 10 minutes of yoga. Maybe it's 10 minutes of focused breathing exercise. It's whatever you need it to be, right? But we put that in there to make sure that we don't get creep. That is, we don't start showing up for work 2 minutes before the hike starts, still zipping up our pants and putting on the tie and, the flat hat if you're a ranger and so forth, and just going out there and crapping all over everybody with a poorly prepared run. We're there. We're taking the time to be fully set and ready to go, and then we start that high-quality interaction with our folks. Okay, so pre-inter, some of this stuff is of course I'm going to check for any exposed live wires jumping around on the ground and sparking and stuff like that. But the preparing self piece of it, is actually a really crucially important side of things. So when you're putting together your sort of template of this 5-part outline, underneath that pre-game or pre-interp section, you want to have these things. Okay? Cool. From there, Sorry, it's about 10 till, so let's take our quick break and we'll shift gears a little bit and do some more active stuff instead of listening to me talk anymore. Okay. Get some water, use the restroom, whatever you need to do. And let's choose one. That looks interesting. We'll have a chance to try all of these out at some point throughout the semester, but let's get started with one that you guys would like to try first.
I like skill demos.
Skill demos. I'd stand that. All right. Anybody else? Is anybody violently opposed to skill demos? Let's do it. All right, so that's our modality. Cool. We've got topics that you have previously selected. We've got theme statements built around any of those topics. Go ahead and just pick one of those theme statements. And for one of our thematic points, one kind of chunk out of the content, we'll start roughing in a skill demo. But in order to get there, we need to have our pre-interp checklist, our pre-flight list ready to go. Okay, so preparing yourself, safety check, facility, materials, completeness of your first aid kit. If it's flint napping, do you have some flint to nap? And so forth, or any of the bone handle tools you're going to use with that. And we'll have identifying participants just kind of as a stub at this point. Leave a little bit of space. We'll add a few other things to our pre-interp section as we go. And then a couple of lines down from there, write introduction. And under that, intro self, right? So you have to announce yourself to this group. Otherwise, you're just going to be a random person that starts flint napping in front of them. And that's going to be weird. Don't make it weird.
Or really cool.
Or really cool. Maybe.
Depends on how it turned out.
Yeah. 60% of the time, it works every time. That's how statistics work. All right. Intro self. And on the next line after intro self, write hook as a second additional entry. You want to hook the audience. So you can introduce yourself not by saying, "Hi, I'm Logan Park, and I'm here to talk at you today about flint napping." You can do something that is interesting, that is unusual, that is curiosity sparking. The hook that Shelton Johnson used in the video that we saw on Monday was him playing that essentially recorder, the wooden flute, out in front of one of the visitor centers at Yosemite National Park. Now, there were a whole bunch of people gathered around there because in the visitor center there was a sign that said, 2 p.m. ranger-led hike, living history, Buffalo Soldiers. So people have a basic sense of what's about to happen. The sign probably also said something like 0.3 miles, very easy terrain, 45 minutes. Just basic sort of bibliographic info about what that hike is going to be. Your introduction is going to identify you as the interpreter through that hook. And then, as you are relating your name and maybe your job title or your living history role, right? So, I'm Sergeant Elise Bowman, and how many of y'all feel like walking around today? Was kind of the way he broached the subject with folks in a living history guided hike way. Okay, so intro self, hook, and then immediately in that same first sentence of who you are and what you're doing today, you are already speaking and modeling, behaviorally showing without words, nonverbal communication. What's the dynamic? And specifically the power dynamic. Is it me going to drill sergeant our way through this and I'm going to tell you what to think and where to be and how to do? And when I want your opinion, I will run my fist up your butt and operate your mouth like a sock puppet and tell you what to say? Or is this going to be a friendly conversation? I'm just going to toss some ideas out there and see what you think about them. That's an appropriate approach for certain kinds of topics. Okay? And the expectations. So, the expectation as expressed in that video on Monday was, all right, now you guys ready to walk with me? Because if I start walking and I turn around and nobody's there, I'm going to start crying. And you don't want to see a soldier cry, right? So, in that sort of polite joke about a soldier crying, that's self-referential humor. That's safe, right? You're not making your participants the butt of a joke ever. You can make yourself the butt of a joke, and it's understood that you're not being particularly serious and like emo, okay? That helps create the expectation of, hey guys, I'm going to start walking. Help me sort of keep this thing on track by staying together. But I'll deliver that in kind of a slightly jokey format in that particular example. You don't have to joke. We'll talk about how to be funny on command later on in this class. There is a theory, science behind humor and how we find things funny. So we'll get after that. Okay, so intro yourself with a hook, and then intro yourself with words, and establish the dynamic, the power dynamic, that is one to many or many to many, more of a circular kind of a thing. And finally, the expectations. Hey y'all, we're going to be on, this is about a 45-minute hike today, and the sign inside says very, very easy. But if anybody would prefer to enjoy this hike in a wheelchair, for example, you might find this to be more of a moderate or difficult hike. And that's okay if you do, but we just want to have everybody with a clear expectation of the kinds of conditions we're going to encounter today. With that said, let's go. And then you're off on the hike. But you got to give people an out beforehand. So you're typically mentioning things like, make sure you use the restroom. I'll hang around here for the next about 90 seconds or so. If anybody needs to make one last quick pit stop before we begin, we'll be out there in the forest for about an hour today, or whatever. So we'll be away from the bathrooms for about an hour. So it's a great idea, and just to make sure, we'll hold the show for about 90 seconds. If that's anybody, go for it. And then we'll head on out, right? So managing the basic biological needs, creature comforts of your visitors or guests. And setting the expectation of, I'm going to walk for about 3 minutes, then we'll stop and chat for about 15, and then I'll walk for another 3 minutes. We'll stop and chat again. And then our final walking segment is going to be about 25 minutes of walking. We're going to go down about 15 steps, uneven steps, on this woods trail. If steps are difficult for you, we just want you to know that we have about 15 of those, and they're on fairly rough terrain. So if that's any sort of a problem, we have other hikes that are going in a slightly different route this afternoon at 3:30 p.m. Why don't you check out that one instead? They're all really good hikes, and so on and so forth. So you're making it okay for people to be like, I don't know if I could do this, right? If anybody's kind of on that fence, they're not feeling real sure about their capacity for the physical activity of it or the social engagement of it, that's okay. We want to set that expectation right away at the beginning. So that's a lot to accomplish in a couple of sentences. And we saw Shelton Johnson do that very compactly in about 3 sentences at the beginning of the expectation setting part of the introduction, right? He was only talking for 60 to 90 seconds before the hike started. That's pretty good. It's easy to talk a lot and waste a bunch of time. Your professors do it a lot. It's hard to be compact, to be very efficient and dialed in with those 3 sentences. So we want to make sure that that's on the outline and not buried down in our content, so that we always are able to check these boxes for everybody's safety and comfort first. Okay? And with those expectations set, with our power dynamics set, at that point, we've got everybody sort of primed and ready, and we're starting to build focus and investment. And as we're turning to start the hike, that's when we peel off the wrapping on the theme. What is this hike really about today? What are we exploring? What are we getting into? What are we going to confront? All right, you can set up any particular dynamic with it. All right? So, theme next after expectations and relationship are set. And then from there, it's time to get into the hike or whatever it is. In our case, for today, skills demonstration. So, we always want to have lots and lots of transitions. You, as the interpreter, know where you're taking this. You have some options. You have some choices. You don't have to run through the same script every time. That's why we do it as an outline. We can edit that on the fly mentally, no problem. But your visitors don't. They have no idea what's coming next. I mean, they know they're walking, but not really what you've got in store for them as a wonderful surprise or 2 or 5. So, we always want to end everything with a clear transition to the next thing. So, every one of these content chunks, each one of these so-called thematic points, is going to have an intro to it and an outro from it. Does that make sense? We're always explicitly connecting the dots for people, because keeping up with all of your cool ideas is really hard work for somebody who's less familiar with it and probably less passionate about it so far than you are. And maybe they warm up to it as you're going, and they can kind of see where you're going with it. But until we get everybody sort of warmed up and super dialed in and invested and focused, and cell phones off or on airplane mode, please don't pull out your cell phones, folks are kind of figuring out, where is he taking us with this? So, right away, even before we start the content, we have a transitional outro to that content. And it's straight into the first chunk. So, typically with a skill demo, it's some chunk of a larger, more complex process, like a very common skill demo that we see in this class in the past has been something like, foraging for wild edibles. It's about that time of year. It's a good topic as any. There'll be more elk season real soon now. And then preparing those wild edibles, cooking them, whatever, and then enjoying those wild edibles. That's like 6 or 8 skill demonstrations for each particular step or chunk of that process. So that's why we split these out into thematic points. The content, in this case, the skill demo, is probably several different skill demos. For flint napping, using chert or flint or obsidian or other natural glass minerals. Right? One skill demo is being able to find this stuff out in the field. What does flint look like? There's a ton of it around here in certain places, and there's none of it in other places. So site selection, and then on-site mineral identification, and then collection, and then starting the napping process, and then refining that napped item, and then finishing that napped item, and then harnessing that spear point onto a shaft, or an arrow point onto a shaft, or what have you. Another skill demonstration involving different materials, like shafts and wooden or leather thongs, for example, to do the affixation or roots or whatever. Okay? So, think about your topic. Think about a skill or series or cluster of skills associated with that topic. Let's take a couple of minutes here to kind of round out class today by just starting to brainstorm in this outline anywhere from 5 to 7 different thematic points. They don't have to be in order. Usually skill demonstrations have some kind of an order. It's a process, right, of working through each stage of that skill. But if some of your ideas don't have to be presented in a certain order, cool. That's great. That's a little bit more flexibility for you, okay? So, take a look at your topics and identify 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 7 different potential stages or chunks or individualized skills out of that topic. Okay. So if your topic is how do oaked staves in barrels affect the taste of beers, right? Microbrewing and homebrewing is like a million different skill steps. So pick any interesting set out of those. Maybe one of those thematic points, maybe one of the early ones, is kind of explaining the background or the context or the mindset for the skill you're about to demonstrate. A particular crochet pattern or stitch, or a particular kayaking or canoeing stroke, or how to approach whitewater hydraulics, or whatever it might be. Explanation can be part of the skill demonstration. That's very important in some cases. So, take a couple minutes, jot some ideas down. Your skill demo, or your topic at least, is fly fishing. So your skill demo is tying flies, site selection for fly fishing appropriate species, casting, landing the catch, preparing the catch to eat, and eating it. That's 5 kind of macro steps in an extended fly fishing skill demo. If your various skill demonstrations, again, typically in a professional context, we're looking at about 5 to 7 thematic points. If those lend themselves well to different sites along an area or continuum, even better. Skill demos can pair pretty easily with a guided hike. So maybe you have a fly tying station at the visitor center, and then you take a half a dozen rods out to the pond out behind the visitor center, like Golden Pond at Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area in Murray, Kentucky. And your next skill demo after fly tying is helping people try to fly cast for the first time, maybe in their lives. 10, 20 minutes. And then to a fish cleaning station for any catches that you get. Or maybe for a couple of fish that you've got pre-caught, so that you have something to demonstrate whether or not anybody catches anything, because you're prepared like that. So it's okay if all the skill demos don't require the same setting or tools or location. You move around pretty easily. Got about a minute left. So, any volunteers? We'll move into preparing to practice these next week. But just to wrap things up for today, any ideas on thematic points? Some sort of sub-skill demos? Yeah.
So I chose creating a good PowerPoint. So the sub-points I had was choosing a theme / design template,
Okay.
Presenting information / media, then animations, transitions, and unique functions, creating interaction, and then delivering information.
Does that make sense to everybody? Right? So we're dividing things out so we can focus a little bit better on each chunk. Okay? If it's all sort of smeared together, it's kind of overwhelming for a lot of people to hold all of it in working memory all at once. Anybody else?
Did miniature painting?
Okay. Slap chop?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please continue.
Just basic. How to base paint,
All right.
washing, a simple layer, a lighter layer, edge highlighting, and then creating interesting bases.
Heck yeah. Let's paint some minis. All right? We'll get some of those new space wolves going. All right. Cool. Warhammer 40K. Niche. Sorry for saying niche. Okay, it's 2:15. We gotta wrap it up for this week. But spend some time before Monday kind of rounding out this list of ideas. So if we're aiming for 5 to 7 to actually deploy, having like 10 or 12 gives you some options to choose from if you're just not feeling the object self-illumination painting demo for one of your skill demos. Maybe you just go with washes instead that day, right? Okay, cool. See you on Monday. Rock and roll. I'm around for questions if you have them.